The EPA was at work again yesterday as they came out and the new 645-page assault, as one group called it, they decided to make some new regulations that are going to cut back on carbon-based power over the next, I think, till 2030. They want to cut it by 30%. And once again, what will that mean to you? Well, it's going to be maybe loss of jobs among people who do work in coal mines. That's a big problem here in Pennsylvania and West Virginia. We have 1,300 such mines there. What will it mean in the future? We're going to ask a very special guest this morning. Amy Ridenour is the chairman of the National Center for Public Policy Research, and she joins us here on the Gary Sutton Show. Amy, always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Well, always great to be with you too, Gary.
Amy, first of all, before we get to the top 10 reasons to oppose these new climate regulations, talk a little bit about what came out yesterday and how you read what was said by the EPA.
Okay, well, what came out yesterday were some very draconian regulations that are intended to cut down by 30% our energy-related CO2 or carbon dioxide emissions. And the purpose for this is because the Obama administration believes that the emission of CO2 is causing catastrophic global warming, and the only way we can stop it is by having these regulations or something like them.
I saw something that was rather interesting. It says the past 17 years, there has been zero global warming recorded, should have forced the president to reconsider, but apparently he doesn't really consider that at all. I've often been taught, follow the money. Is there money to be followed here in this decision with the EPA coming out on behalf of the president?
Oh, well, yes, there always is. One of the places where you're going to look for the money, I think, is that there is, among others, a particularly strong Democratic donor who has pledged to give $50 million to the Democratic Party and to raise another $50 million for them if they work hard against so-called human-caused global warming. So one of the things we have seen in recent months is the administration and Senate Democrats go way out of their way to show that they care about global warming again. Now, they're being sort of careful about this because global warming regulations and laws are not popular with the public. You may recall that back in the 90s, there was the Kyoto Global Warming Treaty. President Clinton sent Al Gore to sign that, but they did not put it to the Senate for a vote because it was unpopular. You'll recall that in 2009, Nancy Pelosi's House passed a cap-and-trade bill over global warming, but the Democrat-run Senate did not even vote on it. So, they're very aware that the public does not like job losses and they do not like electricity price increases, and that's what we're going to get in spades with this kind of regulation. But on the other hand, they want that campaign cash. So, yes, you better believe, look out where the money is.
And, of course, the guy you were talking about, Tom Steyer, is the guy planning the $100 million campaign push right now. And, it's a lot of money to be putting into campaigns around the country, especially in a year when many are saying, well, it may not go well for the Democrats. But that's another subject for another time. You had a piece come out yesterday out of the National Center, and I was really intrigued by this. The top 10 reasons that Washington should not impose new global warming laws or regulations. Let's talk a little bit about those this morning, Amy.
Well, certainly. What we did was we put together your top 10 list. You can get it on nationalcenter.org. And the number one reason that I selected, at least, for why we should not have these regulations is that the planet has not been warming. Indeed, based on the surface temperatures of the planet and the atmospheric temperatures of the planet, we have not had warming on the Earth since the Clinton administration. Now, does that mean that the global warming theory is not true? No, by itself it does not mean that. But I will tell you this, and this is one of the other 10 points why we shouldn't have these regulations, that 96% of the models that climatologists put together since 1979 showing global warming, because that's what we have for this theory. We have computer models. We don't have proof that the global warming treaty is true, just models. 96% of those models have come out false, and false in the direction of predicting warming that did not happen. So we have some very biased models out there. So our models are biased, and the warming hasn't been happening. Those are two pretty good reasons for people to step back and say, wait a minute, maybe actually the theory isn't true.
Well, here's a question, though. Why do so many people then buy into, and companies, too, who are being, I would say, coerced in many cases, why do they buy into this tripe? I mean, what is it about? Are we just that ignorant as a population, or what's going on here?
Well, I think one of the things is that the global warming theory falls into the biases of, frankly, the left. The left likes the idea of nature, of not having, gasoline or coal-fired power plants or things like that. There's a whole ethos on the left that it's not universal, but it's pretty doggone strong, of doing things like going to Whole Foods and not having genetically modified organisms in our foods and just playing that whole nature thing. So when you come up with something like global warming where you say, well, what we're going to do is we're going to have solar power. So you'll still be able to have your laptops, and you'll still be able to drive around in your car, but we'll ask you to get a Prius instead of a pickup truck. Things like that appeal to them culturally. So I think that's number one. Number two, and this is more of the politicians and the people that are running the big green organizations, there's a heck of a lot of power that is given to government if we decide as a culture that we want our government to control our energy use. I mean, just think of the power there, because if you control someone's energy use, you control almost everything about their lives. And this is a nice excuse for that. So if you believe in big government, even sincerely, and someone comes along and says, gosh, here's a problem that can be best solved by having really big government that controls everyone, you're going to be like, whoa, that's great. You're not going to want to give up on the global warming theory because it lets you have everything else you want to. So I think that's a lot of it right there.
I think the idea that somehow you control people, I think that's really a bad thing. I think, listen, one of the problems that we have here, Amy, I believe, and I know I'm not telling you something new, is the idea that we all out there don't want clean water, that we all don't want to make our world a better place, that we all don't want to make the atmosphere better, that we all don't want to have to deal with climate change. The fact is, climate change is. I mean, whether we affected it some or not, climate change is. It is going to do what it's going to do. To me, a lot of times, and maybe this is just me, I want to get your reaction, there's an arrogance to this, that somehow in the last 100 years, we have now affected the climate in such a way that it was not affected over the last 100 million years, for example. And I'm just wondering, are we really that arrogant? Again, you mentioned a very important point in the beginning. This is not based on fact. It is based on models that are being pushed out there by scientists who have nothing more to push it on than what might happen.
Absolutely. People who believe in big government are attracted to the entire concept of global warming, and it's the ability that gives them to have an excuse for big power. But I would say this also. The bottom line here is that human beings do not have the power to control the climate. We don't even understand it yet. Now, it's entirely possible that in 100 years we'll understand it, but we don't understand it right now. First of all, you have to have all the inputs right to have a climate model. And then you have to have a computer that's big enough to take into account every little thing that happens, project accurately the likelihood that the wind will blow this hard this day, or that the ocean currents will do this in 2016 instead of 2017, put it all together and come up with something that actually predicts something. Even then, it's going to say you have a 70% chance of this and a 30% chance of that or whatever. We don't have even the inputs, let alone a computer strong enough to do this. It's just beyond us right now. Climate science itself, I mean, I don't mean meteorology, but climate science itself is a very, very young science. So it's just we're not there yet. And you can say let's not have pollution, for example. And this administration, and this is dishonest in my opinion, they've been running around saying, and the president said it yesterday, that we're going to have less asthma and less heart attacks because we're fighting CO2. CO2 does not cause heart attacks. CO2 does not cause asthma. CO2 is already in the air, and all of the CO2 that we have produced by burning fossil fuels is only a tiny fraction of all the CO2 that's in the atmosphere, because we're breathing it out day in, day out. And then we inhale it, and it doesn't cause a heart attack when we do that. And if 0.1% of it is enhanced, meaning a little bit more, we don't care. We don't even know it.
What's interesting? What's interesting, if you've ever hyperventilated, what's the first thing you do? You put a bag in front of your face, you breathe into that, and you get CO2 in to help kind of balance that off, right?
Well, that's right. Actually, it's a cure in that case.
Yes, it is.
And there's plenty of peer-reviewed literature in science showing that if you have more CO2 in the air, not 100%, but a little bit more, and that's all we're talking about here. I mean, we're talking about a gas that's 4% of the atmosphere, that plants actually grow bigger and stronger. So if you're in a situation where you're growing agriculture, don't you want plants to grow stronger? Yes, you do.
Now, one of the things related in your 10 reasons you should not impose new global warming laws or regulations is the idea that CO2 emissions already fell 12.6% between 2005 and 2012. But worldwide, the emissions went up 17.7% during the same period. So what's the point here is that the United States is doing what we're supposed to do while the rest of the world, and looking at China and places like that, are saying, the heck with you guys. If we're leading, what are we leading right now if no one else is following?
Well, the Europeans are following, and they suffered actually quite a bit because they bought into global warming in a major way. But that said, Europe isn't big enough to solve global warming, and Europe and us together aren't big enough to solve global warming if the theory were to turn out to be true. China is bigger than we are. India is huge. There's all sorts of places in the world that are not as economically developed now as they would like to be, and the cheapest big energy source out there for electricity generation is coal. And frankly, Gary, if the United States was to stop burning coal 100% right now, our coal producers would export it, and the stuff would still get burned, and it would still end up in the atmosphere. It would just be burned in Mexico, or it would be burned in China or India or somewhere else. So this stuff is going to get burned anyhow. But the United States, as you say, we already cut our CO2 emissions dramatically, 12.6% between 2005 and 2012, while worldwide they went up because China and India and elsewhere are developing and will continue to develop. And Russia has no interest in this because its biggest way to get hard cash is selling fossil fuels. So as far as it's concerned, who the heck wants to have global warming treaties? It wants to go gangbusters and sell fossil fuels to everyone. So, we're not getting anywhere. We do all this. We're not getting anywhere because the rest of the world mostly will not go along. And number two, if we decided that we want to cut down CO2 anyway, for whatever reason, the way to do it is not to shut down coal bang just like that, which is what this does. What we should be doing is building nuclear power plants. We can do this despite all the, hype. This can be done safely, has been done safely, and there are no CO2 emissions with nuclear power plants. And unlike, things like solar power, you don't have to have a sunny day to get your electricity out of a nuclear power plant.
We're talking with Amy Ridenour, who's the chairman of the National Center for Public Policy Research. Amy, when we come back, I want to ask you a question, and we'll continue to go through some of these 10 reasons Washington should not impose new global warming laws. We saw come out yesterday, the regulations from the EPA. Why does the president insist that our generation or our generations right now somehow have to suffer for the future? I don't quite understand that. I want to ask you that question to get your response. Amy Ridenour will be back with us right here on the Gary Sutton Show on News Radio 910 WSBA. Welcome back to the Gary Sutton Show on WSBA. We're talking with Amy Ridenour, who's the chairman of the National Center for Public Policy Research and appears in our program from time to time. We're talking about the top 10 reasons to oppose President Obama's new climate regulations. One of the things, Amy, that I do not understand is why, when we saw the EPA secretary come out yesterday, why the idea that we have to suffer now to have better energy choices in the future. It seems to me, and you kind of alluded to that in the earlier segment, that there's a transition period here. Let's get wise about this. If we truly think that global warming or climate change or whatever they're calling it today is true, then why not have a transition period that makes some sense? It's not going to be a hardship on one generation so that another generation can prosper.
Well, I think one reason is that if you have donors to your political campaigns who will give to you if you work on it now, then you're going to want to work on it now. And another financial reason is that there are quite a few scientists out there, not all of them by any means, but quite a few of them that are getting grants for every global warming alarmist paper they come out with. The faster they do it, the more grants they can get. So that pushes action. We also see these major environmental organizations, some of which have budgets in the hundreds of millions of dollars, that can earn and raise money on global warming. So they try to go out and have quote-unquote successes by getting together with people abroad and having, meetings where, the Europeans and the Chinese and everyone will join with us in order to combat global warming. They have wonderful little conferences all over the planet that they fly to with fossil fuels to discuss these things. So there's a lot of reasons why the people that are into this theory enjoy pushing it upon us. And I'm sure that some of them are sincere. Probably the lower down the totem pole they are, the more sincere they get. But at the end of the day, we have a theory that is not coming true. Our models are not proving to be predictive. The planet isn't warming and hasn't warmed since the Clinton administration. And even if we were to do all of this, even if we were to stop all fossil fuel burning in the United States entirely, we would not have an impact that is significant in any way on planetary temperatures if the theory is true, because of what the rest of the world is doing. So the whole thing is a waste of time, but it's worth fighting because lower income people will see all of us, but lower income people suffer more, will see their electricity bills go way up, and hundreds of thousands of Americans will lose their jobs over this. And we've had enough of job losses over the last few years, I think.
It's interesting that with deregulation, the electricity bills have already gone up pretty markedly, and this would add almost an untenable burden onto a lot of people right now, particularly people at the lower end of the poll. And, we asked the question about, if you're going to lose jobs, if you're going to be worse off as a result of this, if you're going to have less money, this big wage gap we talk about in the country maybe isn't due to the fact of the wealthy making more money on the backs of the poor. It might be due to the fact that we're getting overregulated and overhit with things like this.
Well, it's absolutely true. And people should keep in mind, too, that even in coal states will lose a lot of jobs just because there'll be a reduction in demand for coal. But what we'll really see in terms of the job losses is when the electricity bills start to go up, we will see manufacturers move their plants overseas,
right,
or simply buy their products from plants that are already overseas. And so they will shut down American manufacturing plants. Places like Pennsylvania and Ohio and West Virginia and Kentucky can still export coal to the countries abroad. So, ironically, we might see a case where coal miners stay employed, but Americans who work in non-coal industries end up unemployed.
It's going to be an amazing look here, and we can only hope for the best, I guess, right now, and keep fighting back. Amy, thank you for the job you're doing out there, and we look forward to talking to you again very soon.
Thank you, Gary.
Always a
Bye-bye.
pleasure. Take care. Amy Ridenour, the chairman of the National Center for Public Policy Research, with us here on the Gary Sutton Show. Some may agree, some may disagree. We'll take some of those calls later on, too, in the show, as we wanted to get Amy a chance to get out some of those things this morning that she had written about.